here with Charles Johnson. One of the things that I think interests a lot of folks about your work is the philosophical dimension of it. I know I was attracted to it as a grad student in philosophy, came to Middle Passage as a philosophical novel, as an exemplar of that. What's your background in philosophy? Did you study it formally, or was it something?
I almost had enough credits for an undergraduate degree in philosophy, but I took it in journalism because I needed a degree that I felt my parents would see as marketable. And quite literally, I gave my bachelor's degree in journalism to my dad, and I said, "Here, this is for you. This will assure you that I can get a job." Now I'm going back to graduate school in philosophy, and that's for me, because I fell in love with philosophy when I was 18 years old. I guess quite literally with a class taught by a young professor at Southern Illinois University, Dr. John Hawley, and he was his first class on pre-Socratics. And as it turns out, I also took a class within graduate school, my first year of graduate school, in which he sobered me up when I gave a paper on Eastern philosophy, and I understood the difference between what was required and as a graduate student as opposed to an undergraduate student when I took Howley's class. So, a few years ago, 4 or 5, I gave the 17th Paul Tillich lecture at Harvard, to the Divinity School. And who should be in the audience but John Howley? He was his last quarter teaching, and I said to him, "This lecture on Tillich is for you, and the one I should have given in that graduate class where you sobered me up." And so I gave the talk on Tillich. It was actually a smaller version, shorter version. It was kind of like published in Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, on Tillich's objections to Buddhism. So yeah, this has been a passion of mine ever since I was 18 years old.
Do you consider yourself a philosopher first and a writer second, or is there a blend, or do you not think that way about your intellectual approach?
I consider myself to be an artist first, because that's what I came to first, a visual artist, in my teens. And philosophy was a later passion, discovered later. But the PhD in philosophy meant a lot to me. I mean, I would not be content with living this existence had I not done that.
What did it mean?
What did it mean?
What did it mean?
Well, it's my union card.
It was your union card?
Yeah.
What was the union?
Philosophy.
The philosophy?
Yeah.
Have you ever taught intro-type philosophy classes?
When I was a graduate student. When I was a graduate student. Not at UW, because our needs and demands there were always in our writing program for teaching novel writing and teaching short story writing and teaching poetry. We got a 10-person program, but we got like 4 MacArthur Fellows in it. The other 3 are poets, and the most recent is my friend Heather McHugh, preceded by Linda Beard, who got one the same year I did, and before that, poet Rick Kinney. I don't think there's another program, probably, with 4 MacArthur Fellows in it, that size. I think we're pretty unique in that respect. And it's because we teach hard. We teach hard, and so it's a popular program. So our needs were always there. I never taught outside of the department.
I think there's I was trained in philosophy and comparative literature, and from the philosopher's side of the house, the idea of a philosophical novel was kind of an oxymoron, kind of trying to do 2 different things in one piece of writing, one piece of narrative. And from the comp lit side, the literary side, philosophical novels were novels of ideas. They were bad literature. And so I've always felt there's this tension whenever you put someone in a category of being a philosophical novelist, the novelist of ideas, you're somehow or other deflating their philosophical abilities and deflating their literary abilities. And when I say I consider you a philosophical novelist, one of the great ones of the 20th century and into the 21st, I mean it as a compliment. Do you feel any of that?
Those people, I know exactly the kind of objections they're making, and the truth of the matter, it's all hogwash. If somebody does something well, that is to say, a novel doesn't have I used to hear that. When I published my first novel, there was a woman at Stony Brook, who I will not mention her name, who was a teacher, a professor. And I remember she wanted to talk to me. A lot of people wanted to talk to me after Faith in the Good Thing. Professors did. And she said something, what's all this Plato doing in here? What's all this philosophy doing? And it's like, what are you asking me, I wanted to say, you know? Why not? All right, was my issue. If you do it well, it's not a problem. Tell that person to read Invisible Man. Read Ellison's Invisible Man. And then we can have a conversation about whether or not important ideas that illuminate lived experience can occur in a dramatic narrative. Because I know they can. I'll tell you, to be frank, I'm retired. I can say anything I want to. The philosophers who make that argument, they basically are not creative people. That's why they make that argument. All right? You don't find in philosophy very many people who are artists. You know, occasionally you do, but most of the time you don't. Especially not among the analytic philosophers. With the exception of my friend Rebecca Goldstein, who is analytic trained and just has a new book out, by the way. 13 Arguments for the Existence of God, a Fiction, I think is what it's called. And then on the other side, with the literary people, they just don't have the background in the history of ideas, you know, in intellectual history. I don't see any reason. See, this, to me, to make that division like that is what I told you earlier. I think it's intellectual, epistemological apartheid. It's a version of segregation. And obviously, I do not like apartheid and segregation. I don't like artificial walls that are put up by others, particularly when they have very little talent to bring the question anyway. Like, I'm not going to listen to them. And I don't like these little boxes that people take experience and cram them experience into for the sake of convenience. I don't believe in that. I think it's fundamentally wrong. And as a Buddhist, I'm very much not into dualism, as you can imagine. But to be perfectly honest, I think that you get a great talent. You get a genius. That person is going to be able to do what somebody else said is impossible. Because they couldn't do it. They couldn't imagine how to do it. Well, just, you know, forget about that. Just forget about their criticism and do it. Do it because you realize you can do it and because it inspires you. And the challenge of the project will teach you how to solve the problems that come up. The very challenge will give you the answer to, you know, method, technique, approach, and also lots of rewriting. We'll do it too.
Who are the folks you put in that category as philosophical, literary geniuses, folks that are able to blend those two? Of course, you're in that category, so you cannot say yourself. Not that you would.
That's a little bit vain.
You know,
really,
those people. And my worry about it is that we're not encouraging enough of that. You're putting it more in the creative, artistic realm. I think that the reason I asked about the intro course at the university is you have intro to literature, you have intro to philosophy, and the two don't meet. The worlds tend to be very different. We don't read novels in our philosophy classes generally, and you know, in our lit classes, we don't sit down with Immanuel Kant or those kinds of things, or Hegel. It's just would not be put on there. I know too that you have a book coming out.
Yes, indeed, with Michael Boylan.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well,
and get back to those geniuses too.
Well, it's actually Michael Boylan's book. What happened is, over the years, for an event in Seattle, I've been writing short stories. It's called Bedtime Stories. And half of the stories in my last collection, Dr. King's Refrigerator, were written for this evening. It's a fundraiser for Humanities Washington, for, you know, literacy programs and so forth. And I do them for free. And they always give us a prompt. For Dr. King's Refrigerator, the theme that year was a midnight snack. And so I worked it around my imagination and came up with this particular story. Half of the stories I've done and they're all related to bedtime. That event led me to write several stories in which philosophers are protagonists. And I wrote 4 of them, I guess? Yeah. One in which Martin Luther King is a protagonist, Descartes is a protagonist, Plato is a protagonist in the story with Diogenes, and the Buddha is a protagonist. During those 6 years, he was an ascetic before Enlightenment, when he almost killed himself through ascetic practice. So I showed those to Michael Boylan, and he got really fired up about the Plato story, and he wrote 6 stories of his own that then flesh out the rest of the history of philosophy. And he did the introductory material, he did the selection of the primary texts from each of the philosophers, then the study questions, the philosophy puzzles. It's really Michael's book. But I share credit, so I get to go along on the ride. But
Right.
I think it's in the right spirit, the spirit that friends and I have been talking about with excitement, this interface of philosophy and literature since we were undergraduates. This was always where we were mostly finding our interest. You know, I think if somebody goes into philosophy and they're really good in science and math, they wind up over on the analytics side. I just think that they drift that way. Someone comes into philosophy and they're in the arts, I think they naturally kind of drift over to the continental. They find themselves with phenomenology because it speaks to what they're doing in a more immediate way. And so you get people like a Sartre, you know, a playwright and a novelist, as well as a major philosopher. Or you get a Camus, who's got the equivalent of a master's degree in philosophy. I mean, the French, it was not a problem for them. Maybe they just have, you know, more of an interest in this than the British or the Germans. But they certainly didn't back away from this understanding that literature is quite very much a means of disclosure of human experience.
Who would you put on that list of the great ones, the great philosophical novelist, writers, geniuses in that category?
God, I have to think about it.
Yeah.
I have
Doesn't jump out at you.
To do it justice, I have to think about it. I mean, I could mention Santayana, but I don't think that The Last Pilgrim is the greatest novel, okay? And some people will complain about Sartre's novels. And
There's a lot of bad poetry with Santayana.
You know,
I mean, you know, what comes out in my mind is it's not a long list, which is a demonstration of that divide. I mean, I think of people like Nietzsche, perhaps.
Maybe Nietzsche.
Maybe Dostoevsky because of...
What do you do with Thus Spake Zarathustra?
That's a good question.
Or maybe it's a rhetorical question. What do you do with that?
I don't know. I don't know. But I personally, I find it a little bit of a problem if philosophy is that space where we critically think through, examine life, ask questions, pull things apart, put them back together. It's not in our high schools. We don't have intro to philosophy as part.
Yeah.
You don't have a philosophy course. If you do, it's a humanities class.
Right.
If you get to the university, it's a humanities elective, a space. If in the literature departments, it's marginalized for, you know, literature, creative writing, philosophy's not a part, you could end up with highly educated people not having had that exposure to, you know, what is arguably the best space in education to ask the big questions, the important things.
Well, let me give you an
life.
example. I said I fell in love with philosophy when I was 18 years old. Class with the pre-Socratics taught by John Howard. Why did I take that class?
Because the writings were short.
No. There are short fragments. No, I was a journalism major. It was required of journalism majors that they take one philosophy class, logic. That was required. I took that the next quarter. And then an elective. And so my elective in the fall was the Howey course on the pre-Socratics, and then the logic class, which was required. Now, why would journalists be required? Because somebody along the line in the early 60s thought it would be a good idea for journalists to be exposed to these questions, to question themselves probably. It was a wise decision. So logic was a requirement, and you had to fulfill with something else, as an elective, something from the philosophy department.
I'm not happy with the word exposure. Exposure doesn't have the right connotations for something to be exposed to philosophy. It sounds like there's something crude or illicit going on
or infectious.
Infectious, yeah. But well, thanks for your time and thoughts on this topic, and